is actually going on inside of China, in where parts of it are basically in lockdown and have been for the last 4 weeks. Cindy, a very good afternoon to you.
Hi, Mike.
Thanks very much indeed for waiting for us. We're sort of slightly up in the air at the moment because we're not sure when Boris Johnson's going to appear from nowhere. So do forgive us if he does. Fascinating stuff, reading your stuff in the Spectator about what's been going on in China, because often very difficult to find out what's really at the heart of what's happening. Some of the videos we've seen coming out of there, I was told by another correspondent, Ian Williams, of last week, that some of the videos going out are not actually genuine videos, but some are. Tell us what you know.
Yeah, I think when it comes to social media videos, it's very useful for us on the outside to use that kind of thing to judge what's going on the ground. But as Ian Williams was saying, some of those are not genuine. Or if they are genuine, they're not necessarily representative of what's happening, of a policy or wider phenomenon. So, for example, at the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, there were these stories about people being welded into their flats. Now, that to some people in the West seemed like that was a government policy, but actually it was just a local authority taking things into their own hands. So that's the kind of thing we need to kind of differentiate. What is a phenomenon? Because China is such a big country, you know, if you think about it, over in this country, we had drones following people, but that was at no point a policy of the government.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing we have to be careful about when we're looking at these reports. But having said that, it is clear that what is going on with the Shanghai people for the last month has been absolutely horrific. And frankly, nobody expected that kind of stuff to happen in the 21st century, in the richest city in China. The Shanghainese themselves have been absolutely shocked that something like this could happen to them at this moment in time, given their education, given their cosmopolitanism. And I think that's why there's been such a juxtaposition compared to other places that have been locked down, is because the Shanghainese people felt like, well, hold on a minute, famine was a problem of the last century, let alone 2022. And so hence the whiplash effect, basically.
Yeah. It's interesting as well, because I didn't know, and it could be because my own ignorance, I wasn't aware that there was so much kind of social media chatter that goes on inside of China. Tell us about that. So Weibo and WeChat apparently are the two main sort of channels, right?
Right, absolutely. Like any social media platform you can imagine that you use here in the West, there will be a Chinese equivalent too. So people will obviously know that TikTok came from China itself. The Chinese version is called Douyin, which actually has much more functions. You can even buy things on there. So it's like an e-commerce app as well. You've got Weibo, which is like Twitter. You've got WeChat, which is a bit like WhatsApp, but combined with Facebook. So there are lots of things going on, and there are a lot of Chinese, 1 billion Chinese are internet users themselves.
Right.
So that's 2/3 of the population. So they're pretty digital people.
Yeah.
And so my article from The Spectator was basically saying the censors, exist as they do, can't catch up with everyone, because you just can't catch up 1 billion users when they're not 1 billion censors. And even with the help of artificial intelligence and so on, there will be things that fall through the net. And that's what we see.
Yes.
You know, we posted onto Twitter, or if you trawl Chinese social media yourself, as I do, you see that, you know, online for maybe, 5 hours, 10 hours, maybe even a day before someone comes and takes it down.
Right.
And even then you can see the trace of it being taken down. So on WeChat, there's a timeline. People can post on their timelines. If something they posted then gets deleted afterwards, you can still see that they've posted it with the headline it was. Click on it, it says 404 error. So people know when they're being censored, and the censors are just not fast enough, frankly, for that kind of stuff to not get around before they get to it.
That's interesting, because I would have thought that you would have imagined anyway that the Chinese government, if they really wanted to put a stop to all of it, would just put some kind of a block on usage at certain maybe times of the day, or on certain days of the week. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's hard to do. It's hard to do because China's modern economy is so much based on these technological companies. They don't want to necessarily just shut down that entire part of the economy. You know, people live their lives digitally now, and that's a good thing. It's a consumer-based economy in China right now. So there's no easy block. And then the Chinese people also have fun ways of getting around things. So, for example, if you want to talk about the government, 政府 in Chinese, you would, instead of saying writing it out in Chinese, where you could be picked up by a word searcher, you would just say ZF, which is the English abbreviated version of that, how you spell 政府 in English letters. So then you have ZF around, and the censors find it much harder to keep up with that kind of thing, because if you're online a lot, you come up with all sorts of new jargon, new lingo, and the censors really have to know what it is that you're referencing before they can censor anything.
This is always an argument I have about freedom of speech in this country as well, and in the West, I suppose, broadly, because, you know, the technology is always improving. The technology, I fear sometimes, is being used even by the tech companies in the West to kind of mute people rather than augment what they can say and make it easier for them to say things. In this country, they're kind of making it more difficult, whereas in China, it almost sounds as though the public is leading, you know, the way.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. At The Spectator here, we've started our own YouTube channel. It's called Spectator TV. And we've had moments where we touch slightly, you know, spicy topics such as lockdown skepticism. And, you know, those videos often don't do as well. And we've had conversations with YouTube as a platform, you know, are you shadow banning us? You know, are you pushing us down the rankings because you don't think what we say is in alignment with the government's COVID output? You know, they don't give a clear answer to that, but there's no way for people who use these platforms to really know, frankly. It is just suspicious that some videos tend to do amazingly well and others, you know, really kind of stagnate on the exact same channel when they're same format. So that the kind of questions I think people should have about Western social media. And it's interesting, in China, it is down to the social media companies themselves to do the censoring as well. So it's not a government party member clicking behind the laptop.
we had the same problem. We were taken, our entire channel was taken down by YouTube for about 3 days. And they never really did give a satisfactory explanation other than that we had somehow violated their policy. But they couldn't tell us what policy we'd violated, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just no contact. It's just computer says no, isn't it?
It really is, and it's very frustrating, particularly when people start banging on about how free we are here and how unfree they are in China. But let's talk a bit more about the COVID aspect of it, because is the government trying to pursue a sort of net zero, if you like, in COVID terms, or is the new COVID strain that they're dealing with more dangerous? I mean, why have they suddenly become so obsessed with another lockdown?
Well, I think the problem is that Omicron is just so much more infectious. It's not more dangerous as we know here in the UK, where COVID does seem like a thing of 2021, famous last words. But, you know, it is just more infectious, but shown to be more mild. But when the, you know, mark scheme, when the criteria for success in China is no cases at all, a case, even if it's mild, becomes a problem. And so when the zero COVID policy worked for Delta, that's because the R rate would probably be around 2 when it was uncontrolled. Whereas for Omicron, at this peak in Shanghai, one person infected with Omicron was infecting 9 other people, the officials were estimating. So that kind of infection, together with the zero COVID policy, which means that you contact trace every single person. So if you get COVID, you have to be taken into central quarantine. You can't just get better at home. If you come in contact with someone who has COVID, you're taken to a different type of central quarantine center and monitored basically until you can definitely say you're positive or negative, at which point something else happens to you. So that means it provides this massive logistical problem because you're finding places for people to go. It's essentially like Nightingale hospitals used for tens and thousands of people just to be having a mild cold-like symptoms, because the ones with severe symptoms do get moved into hospital. So it's the kind of self-creation of a logistical problem on top of the public health problem that is what Shanghai has seen. And the problem the reason it hasn't happened before is because infections just haven't been as high before under Delta, because it hasn't been as infectious.
But are more people dying as a result, or is it less sort of toxic, less deadly, if you like, than the first wave?
Yeah, I mean, the case fatality rate, it doesn't seem to be incredibly high by comparison to the original Wuhan strain. So far, Shanghai has seen about 400, 500 deaths, and most of them are people, you know, at least over the age of 50 or 60. Normally, you know, the median age is around 70 or 80, with kind of pre-existing conditions that, you know, the same that has been impacting people here. So the death toll isn't huge, but that's not the problem. The problem is that the Chinese government has made the public feel so scared about this virus virus over the last 2 years, that this kind of lack of control over infections, the fact that local infections is happening at all, makes people very, very scared. And that all becomes a political legitimacy problem for the government, because they have been singing and dancing about how well they've done with COVID over the last 2 years. Well, along comes Omicron, and they can't say that anymore until they get on top of this current round. And it's important to say, actually, that because of the way they've done things, Shanghai has been getting better. Case rates are falling. Yeah. So yesterday's numbers was 20% lower than the numbers from the day before. And, you know, we can expect that lockdown to end in that city by the end of May at the latest. Okay. But
that's
other cities are coming under.
That's quite a long way away. I mean, if you said to me you have to wait until the end of May to, next time to go out for dinner, that's quite a long wait, isn't it? I mean, what about the airports? Have they closed access to Shanghai? Have they sort of put a ring around the city, if you like?
Chinese, inbound and outbound flight has been essentially, the borders have been essentially closed since 2020. Someone like me who with family in China, living in London, I haven't been able to go back since 2019 because of COVID. Right. Every time I see someone in the China field, I ask them, when do you think we can go back? Right. And the current estimate is 2023. So not holding out hopes anytime soon. At the moment, basically what they do is that if you find a COVID case on any travel route, that route is then shut down for about 28 days for further monitoring, because perhaps it's coming from a COVID hotspot. Right. Even once you get in, you have to then go through 2 to 4 weeks of quarantine in a hotel to make sure that you haven't brought in the virus from abroad, which essentially rules out a lot of travel. And what we don't hear, because it's China, is how badly the airline companies exactly have been faring. There is no Heathrow chief executive campaigning on the radio for the open borders again.
No, quite. I mean, I did say to Ian Williams, it must be having an effect on the economy as a general rule, not just the airport economy and the airline economy and the travel economy, but just the whole economy must be suffering if people are not going out to work and they're not able to buy things, they're not able to shop, they're not able to, in some cases, get enough food for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think the full impact is coming out yet, but we have seen some signs. For example, in February, the government announced its GDP target this year to be 5.5%. Now, that sounds pretty good to us, but that's actually the lowest in 3 decades for China. And that's even the government's own official target, which will be kind of trumped up a little bit anyway. Yeah, exactly. And even that, various independent investing companies, consultancies like McKinsey, since the Shanghai lockdown, have revised that downwards. So it's now looking like growth is not even going to be 5% for the Chinese economy this year. Right. So that's the macro effect. We also know other smaller things, like in one province in Guangzhou, lockdown last year, the mass testing itself, because what China does is that it brings up like an entire city for mass testing. You see these pictures of people lining up, queuing to have group PCR tests and that kind of thing. That kind of procedure cost that city $1 billion during one lockdown last year. So if that kind of stuff is multiplied across the country all the time, which it is, then the costs are, huge. But I think it's now become not an economic problem or a health problem, but a political problem. Yeah. So that's why they're doing things the way they are.
And there's nobody there saying, by the way, you can't really make this a zero COVID situation. It's never going to happen, because they tried it in New Zealand, which is a much smaller country than China and much less populated, but even they couldn't manage it. So, I mean, it's a sort of hostage to fortune, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And there are people saying that. There are public health officials who do warn that, but they're not really listened to. And we know this because sometimes they break rank. Sometimes social media is a good way to see that. One thing that I've reported on is this one public health official in Shanghai on the phone to someone who was complaining to her about how inhumane the lockdown was. And she was saying, you think I haven't reported up to my uppers about how ridiculous the system is? I have. Nobody listens to me. I have said again and again, people should be quarantining at home. They don't need to be in central quarantine. That Omicron is no worse than a flu at this current stage, unless you've got pre-existing conditions, but nobody listens to me. And it was a really harrowing, heartbreaking phone call, because you just see these people who, are not stupid people, and they're very well read and well educated. They know the science behind all of this, and they think that the approach is not right. But again, they just don't get listened to, because it's not a public health issue anymore. It's a political political issue.
Political issue, yeah, absolutely right. Well, listen, fascinating. Cindy, thank you very much indeed for that insight. Cindy Yu, their broadcast editor of The Spectator, presenter of our Chinese Whispers podcast as well. Fascinating stuff. We'll have more of your calls coming next.